right. So we dive into life hacks today, talking about relationships, family relationships, and family dynamics. I remember when I first got into ministry, 20-some years ago, I was working with high schoolers, and as you deal with high schoolers, there are these, hormonally charged individuals who are dealing with family issues and trying to coach them through that and realizing, man, they got some tough family dynamics going on there. And then I started working with junior hires, and junior hires I discovered are a whole different breed all of their own. If you work with junior hires, God bless you. Junior high teachers, small group leaders. Now I got a couple in my house. They're still a unique breed. But they have interpersonal relationship elements that they're trying to figure out with their family too, and coaching them is unique. Then I started working with college age and young adult age kind of individuals, and discovered that as these individuals are starting to leave the home and fly the coop, there's some unique family relationships and dynamics they're facing. Coaching them was pretty tough. Same time, we were starting to have kids, so I'm dealing with a lot of young adults with young children, and coaching them and walking beside them in life and realizing, man, there's some unique family dynamics at that stage. Then about 10 years ago, I started working with adults and realizing, man, adults have it tough as well, because as a lot of them are dealing with grown children, there's some crazy dynamics with that. And one of the things that I've come to realize is families are cray-cray. They are. They get tough at times. Family dynamics can be really difficult. And what I want to do today is I just want to look at 5 kind of, I think, critical elements to building a healthy family, having healthy family dynamics. And if maybe you've got family that's distant or away, or you don't have a lot near you, I would say all these same principles apply if you want to have an influence upon others, maybe in a mentoring relationship. Maybe you're leading a small group. These are some really simple, critical elements that will apply in those relationships as well, okay? And the guy I want to look at King David as our template, okay? So now here's the deal. If you do not have the most perfect family, awesome. You are going to relate to King David because he had a messed up family. And we're going to learn some things from King David in terms of he did some good things and he did a lot of bad things. So we can learn from both kind of sides of the coin. The good things, follow in his footsteps. The bad things, avoid those things and do the opposite. And so the place I want to start is where many of us think of David. And when we're thinking about him, there's a place where many of us start the journey. So we often think about David through the lens of beginning with David and who? David and Goliath, that battle. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And here's kind of the setting or the context. King David, he's not the king at the time. He is just a shepherd boy, and he's actually the youngest of 8 brothers, okay? And his 3 oldest brothers are out at the battle lines with King Saul. And what has happened is basically you got the nation of Israel on one kind of ridge, and the nation, it's the Philistines, on the other ridge with a valley in between them. And this guy named Goliath, who was a giant, came walking down, and he would taunt the Israelites every day. And he was doing this for 40 days in a row. He's coming down, he's taunting the Israelites, saying, your God is weak, you guys are weak. And basically he's saying, send out your greatest warrior. We'll do a head-to-head battle. Me, Goliath, against your guy. Whoever wins kills the other one. That nation will serve the other nation. So just instead of the nations going to war, just a one-on-one battle. Whoever wins will represent the nations. So David is basically, he's being sent by his father to go bring food supplies to his older brothers who are at the battle lines. And when he arrives right as this guy Goliath is coming down to do his daily taunt of the Israelites. And as he hears Goliath taunt the Israelites, he's like, who is this guy? What happens to the guy who defeats this guy? What happens to the guy who's willing to face this guy? He's just inquiring. And David's oldest brother kind of inserts himself because he doesn't like how David is asserting himself in trying to find out information. This is what his oldest brother says to him, and this is 1 Samuel 17:28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him, and he asked, why have you come down here? With whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. So David's oldest brother, notice what he does here. He belittles David's work. He's just watching a few sheep. He name calls him, you're conceited, and he even accuses his motives. You came down here just to watch the battle. Your heart is wicked. And the first thing that David models here is actually, it's one of the few good things David models in his life in terms of family relationships. But right here, he models healthy boundaries. He actually has and establishes some good, healthy boundaries. And I would say this is always the place to start. If you want to have healthy relationships within your family, and once again, this can be with your children, it can be with your parents. If you're a grown adult, you're with your parents, sometimes establishing healthy boundaries there. Your siblings, a mentoring relationship, having healthy boundaries. So how do you know if you have healthy boundaries? What would define that? Here's the phrase I always go back to. You know you have healthy boundaries if someone else's unhealthy behavior does not impact your behavior. Let me say it again. You know you have healthy boundaries if someone else's unhealthy behavior is not or does not impact your behavior, your right behavior. Okay? So David's brother demonstrates some really unhealthy behavior. Right? He comes out, he belittles David, he name calls, he accuses his motivations. But notice how David kind of establishes healthy boundaries. In the following verses, verse 29 and 30, it says this. David responds to his brother, what have I done? Can I even speak? And then notice what it says. He then what? Turned away. He then, instead of like engaging in this unhealthy argument that he knows isn't going to go anywhere, he then turned away from his brother, turned to someone else, brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. But what David does is he actually models something really good here. He sees his brother's unhealthy behavior, and he doesn't let it impact his behavior. He's like, listen, I'm not going to engage in this unhealthy argument. It's not going to go anywhere, so I'm going to turn away, and I'm going to do the right thing, which ultimately is going to lead him to facing Goliath. But what are some of the ways that we fall into kind of unhealthy boundaries, unhealthy relational boundaries? And here's some of the ways I see it in even grown adults. Sometimes it will be in individuals who have never really cut the umbilical cord. You know, this passage says, leave your father and mother and be united to your wife, and the two shall become one. It's this idea of that you still are relying upon your parents, maybe financially or emotionally. Maybe you're not relying upon them financially at all, but you still rely upon them for their approval. You don't make any decisions without their approval first. It might be a sign that you haven't cut the cord. Sometimes it's in codependency in relationships or manipulation in relationships. Sometimes it's the exact same things that David's older brother does. It could be they belittle you and so you give in. It could be that they name call or they bully you and so you give in. And sometimes even, you want to know what bullying can sometimes sound like? It can sound like simple things like this. You're lucky that I don't fill in the blank. You're lucky I don't whatever that bad thing is that they're, and what they're saying is, aren't I so gracious not to do that horrible thing, but if you don't give me my way, I might do that horrible thing. And this is kind of what David's brother's doing, or it's the attack of the motives. We just finished Christmas, and some of you might have actually even heard this Christmas. Don't elbow at anyone if they're nearby you. But it could have sounded something like this. You don't even want to be with us for Christmas. Fine, we'll come for Christmas. What they do, they accuse your motives, and they spoke a false motive that might not have existed. You don't even want to be with me. That's not true. I want to be with you. I have healthy boundaries, though. Or we have other priorities in our life that are trumping. But these are the simple ways that someone else's unhealthy behavior can actually impact our behavior. And you'll know you have healthy boundaries if someone else's unhealthy behavior does not impact your behavior. Okay, so that first one is healthy boundaries. All right, we'll go to number 2. Okay, so now we think of where David begins. He has this epic battle with Goliath, but at that moment, he doesn't become king. King Saul reigns for many years. Then King David actually becomes king, and he reigns for a whole slew of years. And during this, you got to understand, kings in that day and age often had many wives and many family systems. So if you think your family system is complex, David had many family systems that were all clashing with one another. I think it's why in the New Testament the apostles were finally just laid down the law and they said, listen, husband of one wife, that'll do for all of us, okay? And so it's one family system's enough. But David had multiple family systems. So let me just explain what ends up happening is his family systems, through one wife, he had a son by the name of Absalom. Through another wife, or Amnon. This hand is gonna represent Amnon. I gotta stay consistent, otherwise I get confused. All right, through one wife, he had Amnon. Through another wife, he had this son named Absalom. Underneath Absalom, he was the oldest brother. Underneath him, with the same wife, he had a daughter named Tamar. This son Amnon had the hots for Tamar, which was messed up, and then he raped her. So now you've got these two family systems that are almost at war with one another. Absalom is hating his brother for dishonoring and raping his sister, and Amnon is kind of despising that family system, and David's furious in the midst of it all. But David, what we see in this major crisis is happening in David's family, and yet the second element is missing in David's response. And the second element is this: it's intentional investment. It's an intentional investment to insert yourself into the relationship. We see David do the opposite, where he's distant and he's alienated himself. Notice what it says in 2 Samuel 13, verse 21. It says, when King David heard all this, everything that happened between Amnon and Tamar, he was furious. Right? Now, you would think as the king, you're going to go and punish your son or rebuke your son or do something to step in the middle of this. But that's the only verse that we hear at all throughout Scripture in terms of how he responds to this horrific event that takes place in his family. He's just mad. Then Absalom never says a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. And then 2 years later, 2 years go by, and then Absalom basically invites all the king's sons over to his house for a party, and it's actually a conspiracy to try to kill Amnon. Okay, so here's what we see. We got David, who all we know is he's furious, but he does nothing. We see his two sons that follow their dad's model of how they live life. They don't speak to each other either. It says they don't say anything to one another, good or bad. Now, you got to understand, these are grown men at this point, so they have their own estates and their own homes in the kingdom, and they just choose basically to not talk to one another, good or bad, for 2 years. So the family's just not talking. If you think man, my family's messed up, this one messed up, David's family. It's just they're distant. They're not having any intentional investment in the relationship. And quite frankly, if you want to have an impact upon your family, upon your children, upon maybe a mentoring relationship, you've got to be intentional in investing in that relationship. Now, if you've got broken relationships that are distant, it might be a sticky situation of figuring out, how am I going to bridge this first communication gap that we haven't spoken in years? How am I going to reach out? But I would say you've got to start intentionally investing in that relationship right now. I know for me, some of the most important relationships were those who intentionally invested in me. For me, a lot of them were my small group leaders. Growing up in youth group, it was my small group leaders in junior high, my small group leaders in high school. And it's not please don't think man, we were hanging out every single weekend. We weren't. But I remember there was regularly, we were over at their house, or I'd spend the night with my small group out there, or they would be at my sporting event. And it was just this consistent, intentional investment that they became the most important kind of second voice in my life besides my parents. And for you, if you want to have an impact, an influence, you've got to start intentionally investing in those relationships. All right, now the next two, I'm going to actually lump together in terms of what we need to do. Healthy boundaries, intentional investment, and then these next two is truth-telling and facing of facts. We've got to be willing to tell the truth, hard truth, and facing facts. Okay, so now here's what happens. You got these two brothers, Amnon, Absalom. Absalom devises this plan. Let's invite all of the siblings on over. He basically is trying to get Amnon over to his house to kill him, and that's what he does. He kills his brother Amnon. Now, you would think, once again, David's going to, lay down, bring down the hammer and discipline his son, but he doesn't. He mourns the death of Amnon, but he doesn't discipline Absalom. Since Absalom sees his father as kind of this weak and distant dad, he starts thinking to himself, maybe I should rule over this kingdom. I could probably do it better than my dad, King David. So he kind of devises this conspiracy to try to kill King David, take his father's throne. Okay, so if you don't think your family system's too messed up, at least your kid probably doesn't want to kill you yet. So David has got that, though. His son literally wants to kill him. David hears about the conspiracy, and because he's kind of this distant, non-intentional investment father, he actually he feels like he's blowing it in life, that he literally flees Jerusalem. He's like, I guess you can just have it. He's sorrowful over the loss of Amnon. He feels like a failure, and he just says, I'm going to leave Jerusalem. So as he's leaving Jerusalem, all of the troops that are loyal to him and his commanders all follow David as they flee the city and are basically handing it over to Absalom. Absalom, who has rallied troops and people to follow him, basically are not content just living in Jerusalem. They go chasing David out into the wilderness to try to kill him because he wants to kill his father. And so an epic battle takes place in which even David, they both, Absalom and David's troops lose thousands of men. David loses 20,000 men, but at the end of the day, Absalom's killed. David's troops kill Absalom. And so you would think, all right, the victory is theirs. They can go back and take Jerusalem and they can establish the kingdom. But David instead is found weeping over the death of his son Absalom. His only command to all of his troops was, don't harm my son. Don't harm my son. Don't harm my son. The problem is Absalom's command to his troops is kill my dad, kill my dad, kill my dad. And so this guy by the name of Joab, who's David's commander, basically one of the guys leading the troops, takes this next step of telling David the hard truth that he doesn't want to hear, and everyone's kind of afraid to tell him. But it's found in 2 Samuel 19, verse 5 through 7. Notice what it says. Joab went into the house of the king, and he said, today you've humiliated all your men. You who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines. You love those who hate you, referring to Absalom, and you hate those who love you, referring to us, the troops. You've made it clear today that the commander and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead. Now go out there, encourage your men, or I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left here by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now. And what Joab does is he says the hard things to David that David probably doesn't want to hear, but he desperately needs to hear. Now, before you go on out of here and you're like, sweet, pastor told me to tell the truth and be bold on it, please don't just go up to people you don't know and you're like, hey, I observed this. Let me tell you the truth. Like, that's a bad idea, okay? Joab actually has kind of an existing trusted relationship with David. At least at this point in their life, he does. So if you want to be able to speak the hard truth to people, you had better also be doing the previous thing, which is intentionally investing in the relationship. It's through that you build trust and relationship that you can speak the hard truths to those that you love. And if you want to influence your kids, your family, those around you, you can't be afraid to say the hard things to them. I remember when I was in high school, it was my senior year, I was in track and field, and I was a pole vaulter. And my pole vault coach, he was a pastor. He was a youth pastor, not at my church, but at another church, and he knew I was a Christian. And one day he came to me, and he just kind of got in my face. He's like, Josh, I just want to tell you something. I don't think you're living your Christian faith consistently. And I think God's made you for more. And if you would be bold in your walk, I think God can do some powerful things, but you can't be afraid of your peer relationships. And there was part of me that was like, who are you to tell me? I was like kind of mad. But sometimes what we do is you can come to church and you can like put on your best face in front of like, all right, pastor might see us. Some people might see us. You elbow your kids, get it together, you know? Let's put it on, you know, on the right, or maybe in front of your youth pastor, teenagers, you might portray yourself one way. But this guy, he saw me every day among my peers. He saw me for who I was. And he was calling out what he saw. He's like, this doesn't all add up. What you claim about your faith and how you're acting at school isn't all acting up. And he spoke the truth. which really led me to this next one, which is facing the facts. He said it in such a way that I had to now grapple with, what are the facts? Am I doing what he's saying or am I not? Am I consistent or am I not? And in David's life, he quite frankly was not even facing the reality of his own facts. I think David, man, when I think about this whole situation, David's in his own world. He's just kind of lost in his own little world, and he's choosing to give his son the benefit of the doubt, although his son is trying to kill him. He's trying to take his throne and kill him. And everyone else sees it, but David doesn't see it. He's living in denial of it. He's living in denial of the facts, and he just doesn't want to see what everyone else sees. What everyone else sees is your son's actions are horrible. He's a horrible man. And David's like, I love my son. And everyone's like, your son wants to kill you. Wake up. And here's what sometimes happens when it comes to parents or even best friends. Sometimes this is what we'll hear. Well, this is my child, or this is my best friend, and I want to see or I want to believe the best in them or for them. But in doing so, you might be living in denial of the reality and you may not be facing the facts. And sometimes as parents, we give our kids the benefit of the doubt, and I think you should to some degree. I think you should fight for your children. You should be the advocate for your children. But at the same time, you cannot live in denial of the reality of the facts and how their actions are impacting other people. And we'll talk about how you can do that better in terms of facing facts in just a minute when I bring the panel up here. Final thing. So, healthy boundaries, intentional investment, truth-telling, facing the facts. Final thing is calling people up. This is something David does well at the end of his life. He rules over his kingdom the rest of his life, and then at the final end, he's kind of passing the baton to his son Solomon, who's actually going to be the next king. And King Solomon, as he's passing the baton, this is what David does. He calls his son up. It's this I see in you moment. This is what I see God could do in you. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 2, he says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. So now be strong, show yourself a man. Observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways. Keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may be prosperous in all that you do and wherever you go. I love how he starts it. He's like, show yourself a man. You want to show that you're a man? Here's what a man looks like. He's a guy who honors God with all that he is, loves God, is obedient to his ways. If you're faithful to God, you're going to prosper and your kingdom will be prosperous. And basically what he does is he says, this is what I know you're capable of. This is what I believe God has actually called you to, and I want to call you up to it. And I know in my life, some of the most impactful moments that kind of changed the trajectory of my life is when people said to me, here's what I see in you. This is what I see God, I believe, wants to do in you and through you if you'd walk with him and walk in obedience to him. And so just hearing kind of someone vision cast what they believe God's vision for my life would be, all of a sudden makes me go, man, it is worth loving God with all I am and surrendering all that I am to him. So I want to just bring up the panel right now. Let's bring up Pastor Jeff, Pastor Eric, Pastor Lisa, and we're just going to have a conversation about these 5 things, about just now some hacks of how we've learned to do these things well in our lives or apply these things well. And so I've just got 5 questions around each of the 5 things. So one question for each subject, and hopefully we'll have some good time. Would you just welcome them to the stage here with me? I hope you've enjoyed having them up here all throughout this series. Has this been good? Some good conversation with them? You can't, I know, I put you on the spot and you're like, boo, no, I don't like it. All right, let's just dive right into this because we're always limited on time. But let's start with this. What life hacks have you learned around maintaining or enforcing healthy boundaries? So once again, being able to recognize when someone else's unhealthy behavior is active and not allowing it to impact your behavior. So what have you learned in doing that? Eric, we'll start with you.
We picked this up actually from the guy that we did like premarital counseling with, like you were talking about last week. So we got a lot of life hacks there. But one was, always prioritize your spouse, but specifically as far as like fighting for your spouse, and specifically like I decided I'm always going to fight for my wife with my family. So as you get married and all the traditions change and any frustrations that come up with the in-laws, I didn't want to make my wife like stand up for herself or fight her own battles with my family. And so even if it was something that she noticed, I was going to kind of bring it up.
Yeah, that is good. Jeff, you had some good ones.
Yeah, so our story is I was the first sibling in my family to get married, and I was the youngest of all the siblings. And so I had to live into boundaries that my siblings were not living in just because my allegiance, my priorities were totally turned on its head. And so I just learned really quickly and had mentors in my life who just said, God, Corey, and the kids. God, Corey, and the kids. God, Corey, and the kids. And so just locking that in and reminding myself of those truths, it really helped us out when it came holiday time and when it came to family dinners and expectations that were thrown on us for that. And so, it was just something that we had to learn. But I think another point that's important to make is that as parents, we need to grieve the transitions that our kids are going through. And I think we see that maybe as early as sending them to preschool or sending them to kindergarten. But then I also saw in ministry, parents do this really well when it came to sending their kid to college or walking their kid down the aisle. Like, these are really happy moments, but there's also some grief there that things are changing. And I think one of the healthiest things we can do is not project a lot of that stuff onto our kids. We got to deal with our own stuff and not just throw our garbage on them, but walk through it in a healthy way.
Yeah, I know for me, there's a question that I ask to find if my actions are being impacted by someone else's unhealthy behavior. And it's simply this: would I script my life to respond in the situation based around my values and my priorities at this time? Like, how would I script my response in this situation if this other person weren't a part of the scenario? Because what happens is we often respond out of emotion, and I totally get that we're in relationships, and so relationships are emotional. But what we actually want to do is kind of remove the emotional side of things and just deal with it. Would I script my response in this situation based on my values and my priorities this way, or am I scripting it this way out of emotional response because of manipulation or whatever, or hurt? That type of thing.
So
that's
along with that emotion, I think a lot of times in life we have people that come and they emotionally vomit on us. And it's important. We learned this thing from our care pastor at our last church. Will you hold the mic so I can show him? So we do this, and Josh and I do this a lot. This is me. This is not me. This is me. And it's just kind of that separation of you. If you encounter somebody who's emotionally charged, you don't have to pick that up. You don't have to carry that. This is me. This is not me. That's not my responsibility. That's not my burden. This is me. So even it kind of plays out like you're at home and you as a mom have made your house peaceful all day long, and it's calm and it's loving, and maybe the teenager comes home or the husband comes home and they've had a bad day and they just kind of come and want to explode all over everybody. And that's where you're like, oh, this is me. This is not me. I'm not going to pick that up. Maybe go back to the garage, take a minute, take a breath, and then come back in when you can come into the peace and enjoy the peace and not explode all over the place.
Yeah. Well, we've taught this to our staff, and I know that it's pretty regular that a staff member will say, I had a this is me, this is not me, this is me conversation this week with people, who are just like, they're trying to unload their problem upon maybe a staff member here at the church, and they're like, no, just having to create healthy boundaries once again. All right, let's shift to the next one. What life hacks have you learned about intentional investment? How do you invest in relationships? Jeff?
Yeah, so I keep saying that this is not really groundbreaking, but it's just an important rhythm that I've gotten into as a dad, is that whenever I'm going somewhere with a kid with me. And I know that some people are in the room and they're like, I can't get away from kids. I'm around kids all the time. And so I'm around people all the time, all day long. And I just have found, hey, if I'm going to the grocery store, if I'm making a quick trip, I'm taking a kid with me. And it's really cool to see our kids spend that time differently. Some want to just quiet ride with dad. Some want to blast the worship music. Some want to just talk my ear off. And they talk my ear off in a way they usually don't when other siblings are around. And so that's been a cool way to intentionally invest.
Yeah. I say this: frequency over quality. Let me say it again. Frequency over quality. Meaning this, not every moment with your family is magical. Or with your children, it's just not. Can you get this? You understand? It's not all magical moments, but if frequency, meaning investing in the relationship consistently over time, will have an impact. And so sometimes it can be really short, but just consistently. And so even last week we were talking about love languages and the importance of knowing the love language with your spouse, but knowing the love language with your kids, your siblings, your parents, knowing those love languages is really important. And then speaking that, like I realized it one day when I was hugging one of my daughters, and as I was hugging her, she goes, "This is nice." And when she said that, all of a sudden it hit me. I'm like, "Oh, I don't think I'd hugged her in like a week." And just going, oh, this is her love language. She just needs a good hug. And so I tried to purpose, all right, for her, she needs a good kind of extended hug every day. It might only be a few moments. It doesn't have, not every moment's magical, but just once again, consistency. And every child needs something different. You know, some of my boys down there, they just need to be slammed to the ground. And they're like, "Dad loves me," you know? And that's all they need. It's just one good slam and they're good. So just figure out what that is and give it to them consistently. Lisa.
Yeah, so we have a lot of kids, and so time is limited, and it's just a challenge. So one thing that we do is we make every moment count. So if I'm on the couch with one kid or in the kitchen and there's one kid with me, we're always saying, "Hey, how you doing? How's your heart? What's going on? How are the friends?" Asking those probing questions often, which just bridges the communication gap and opens up lines for communication.
Yeah. Eric, you had a great one this week. We already stole it, so get ready. Get ready for a good one.
Yeah, that's cool that you guys like that. This is something that my wife and I learned from a different pastor, like a family pastor, and he had this great quote talking about intentional investment, and he said, "If it's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly." And that sounds really backwards, you know?
It does.
But he's like, hey, if you're going to spend time with somebody or invest intentionally, he was specifically talking about if you've ever tried, like with your spouse or with your kids or as a family, to have like devotional time or to pray together, read the Bible, you know, it feels so hard to do. It feels awkward sometimes. Like, why is this so hard to do? And he was trying to encourage families to just try and to go after it and said, hey, listen, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. If you only read one verse and one kid's crying, it's better than not. You know, if you only pray together once a week, that's better than not praying together at all. And so, you know, just get out there, and if it's worth doing poorly.
Yeah. Yeah, aim for better than poor. But understand, a lot of times, like, once again, if you're praying with your spouse for the first time and you're like, this might stink. And once again, better than to do it poorly than to do nothing at all, which is what most people do. All right. How about this one? What life hacks have you learned about how to be a truth teller in hard situations? Eric, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no one likes to have those conversations. If you do, that's not good, you know? Like, I got some stuff to tell you, you know? So for me, I just had to feel myself like this is worth it. And even like I believe that this is right. I need that internal belief. And because it's not fun, it's difficult, and more than that, like there's like this relational risk, like you're putting yourself out there, you're putting the relationship kind of on the line, and so it's like I want to really believe in this before I open my mouth, and then even prayerfully believe in it. Like, God, would you have me start up this conversation? Would you have me say this? And then really to check my heart and say, is this out of love? You know, I don't want to just tell you what I see just because it's true, but am I telling you this because I think it's good for you, and am I saying it because I love you? And then if I believe in it, then I have to do it.
Yeah. This is a hack that I've used. I call it, it's the truth sandwich. So this is how you lead into it. I say, I love you, I see in you the truth, I see in you, I love you. So I work my way in and out. So with I love you, here's what I see God wants to do in you. However, here's the truth that I see that's keeping you from that. This is what I see God wants to do within, I love you. You know, so you're surrounding this thing with a lot of good stuff, but it's just like this is the thing that you got to face in the middle. And so it's the truth sandwich, and people are able to swallow it a little bit better that way. Jeff, you had one thing.
Yeah, I learned this phrase from Pastor Jim Leggett, a guy that I did ministry with for many years. And he said it, and then I heard him execute these kind of conversations over and over and over again. And the phrase is this: this is what I heard, tell me if it's true. And I just thought that was so freeing for conversations that sometimes you hear secondhand information about your kids or about, something else going on at the workplace, all these things in relationships. And so sometimes we think like, oh, I don't want to get that person in trouble. But this phrase actually frees all that up by just focusing on the truth. What is true? And how do we handle it? How do we go from here? And I think the season that I needed it the most was in high school. When you hear all this secondhand information and you need to address it and you don't know how. I needed it then, and I wish I would have learned it like 20 years earlier. That would have been great.
Yeah, it's a great phrase. Say it one more time, though, so everyone can write it down.
This is what I heard. Tell me if it's true.
Yeah. All right, next question. How do you help someone who isn't facing the facts see the facts? How do you help them, someone face the facts even for themselves? I'll start with answering this one. I use leading questions. So it's very rarely is it going to be any good to just try to say, here are the facts, see it. They're not going to see it. But if you can use leading questions that will help them discover it themselves, people always believe what they come to discover on their own. And so if you can use a question that leads them there, that's the best way. And so here's the leading questions that you need to use, is questions that help push someone into someone else's shoes. So we always look at life through our own lens, which is selfish by nature, right? You look at it through your own eyes. So what you're trying to do is get other people to look at life through someone else's eyes. If you can do that, you're getting them to think unselfishly. And in the process, they're going to be able to face facts. So like, let's say I have a belligerent child. Instead of just saying, these are the facts, see it my way, they're probably not going to do that. But if I can say, hey, go to your room, I want you to think about this for a minute and come back to me when you can tell me how you think your actions impacted someone else, when you can tell me how they felt when you did that thing. See, when they can articulate that, it means that they've stepped outside of their own selfish lens, they've looked at it through someone else's lens, and they will have usually faced the facts of the reality. So that's kind of how I do it. Lisa.
Yeah, so we were kind of joking that it's like you might be a parent who's not facing the facts like the Jeff Foxworthy thing. So you might be a parent that's living in denial if your child's behavior is always somebody else's fault. If this child would have done this, then mine wouldn't have reacted this way. Or if this child would have done this, if the teacher would have done this, if somebody else would have done this. If it's always somebody else's fault, you might be living in denial. So one thing that we do in our house from a young age when they're little is we make our kids take responsibility for their attitude and behavior. So kids do this a lot. Well, they made me scream. No, that was a choice. Like we make that very clear. That was a choice. They may have done something wrong, but you have a choice to react in a right way or a wrong way. That's a choice. You also might be a parent in denial if you're always sheltering your kid from the consequences of what they're doing. Consequence is like the greatest teacher in the world for children, that they learn, when I do this, it hurts somebody else. When I do this, it impacts the family. That sheltering your kid, they'll never learn. They'll be the adult that doesn't realize that they are wrecking people all around them because they never learned as a kid.
Yeah. Jeff, you had a good insight here.
Yeah, in our conversations this week, we talked about how important in facing the facts group life is. That when you get into a group just acts as a mirror to your life, and it's a good opportunity in a safe living room to say, what am I not seeing? After sharing something about your life, what am I not seeing? Is there something I'm missing? What do I need to hear? And I think that groups really come into this and help us live in a more healthy way.
Yeah. Last question. How have you been called up, or how do you call others up, and how do you do that? Lisa, we'll start with you.
So Josh does this for me and has for years, but I heard Pastor Stephen Furtick say one time that he felt like it was his job as the husband to mine the depths of his wife's giftedness and draw it up. And I thought, he is the best husband in the world. But Josh has done that consistently for me.
He stole it from me.
But I just love that idea that my husband is the one who's saying, I see this in you. Let's explore that. Let's give you the platform to do that. Let's give you, so that I wouldn't be here today if it was not for him being a cheerleader for that. I also had a woman who came to our house just to pray for us. It wasn't anything staged, but during the prayer, she was praying and she stopped and she said, Lisa, have you ever thought about being a leader? I feel like that's something the Lord has on your life. And I'm like, no, like that is not me at all. But she spoke something to life, and it was a seed planted on my heart. And then I began to explore that with the Lord, and he developed that into something. So just that's what got me where I am today.
Yeah. You guys were talking about some of the dynamics of how sometimes it just comes out. Eric, you were sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been called up by people, and sometimes it comes from a truth-telling conversation. Sometimes it comes just out of this amazing, I see this in you. But I've also been the giver of that, and sometimes even on accident. So there was a guy that was a volunteer in our student ministry at a church I used to work at about 5 or 6 years ago, and just an awesome guy, loved the Lord, loved students, served a ton, just kept becoming a bigger and bigger part of our leadership team. And so one day we were hanging out, and I just, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but I think it was the Lord. I didn't know it at the time. I just kind of said, half jokingly and half seriously to him, I said, hey, if your career never works out, and he had like this nice kind of career path going for himself, I was like, if that doesn't work out for you, you'd make a great youth pastor, you know? And I didn't realize that meant a lot to him. And God used that. So within a year, he was talking to me and some guys from our church and saying, I feel like God's telling me to quit my career and go into full-time ministry. And so we started like talking about that and taking next steps with him, and he ended up, becoming a pastor now for the last 5 years. But the coolest part was I've been able to hear him tell his story to groups of people, and part of his story is that conversation, that one sentence I said almost half jokingly. He's like, there was this guy named Eric that kind of planted this seed in me. I was like, I didn't know I was being so prolific, and so it's just really cool that God can use those conversations, even when you're just kind of throwing something out there. You believe it, but you didn't feel like you were woken up in the middle of the night and told to say it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the coolest details about that story is that it happened at Chick-fil-A. It was just there. It's just a normal, like, Chick-fil-A is awesome,
That's
but
right.
it's also just an ordinary place. And I think, Lisa, you were sharing too, that friend spoke into your life, and it wasn't staged. And I think about the I see in you moments, and rarely, I can't think of even one in my life that it happened at this like formal meeting. Let's talk about this. It's these spontaneous moments. It's in rooms like this. It's in the lobby. It's in living rooms. It just comes up. And so take the boldness when you're prompted. Be bold in speaking that I see in you in people's lives.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's almost awkward to say that. It's almost easier for me to tell you guys if I think he's really a great guy or something.
Yeah.
Especially with dudes, it just feels awkward for me to compliment you. And so get over the awkwardness. And if you see something in someone and you're proud of them, if you've got some encouraging words, as easy as it is to tell somebody else, tell them to their face and let them be encouraged.
Yeah. And I think it is. It's those small little tiny phrases that I know have been huge trajectory shifts for my life and many other people's lives. So when you see something kingdom being displayed in someone else, a lot of times they just don't even see it. You should call it out in them. So, all right, let me close this here in prayer, and then we'll be done. Lord, we need your help to have healthy boundaries, to learn how to intentionally invest, especially maybe in distant relationships that are broken right now, to how to reestablish those. So give us wisdom in that, to speak truth, make sure that, Lord, take control of our tongues, that it wouldn't be our thoughts, but it would be your thoughts, and that for those of us who need to face facts, that maybe we're living in denial, or help someone else face facts, give us wisdom on how to do that. And Lord, I pray that you would make us into a people that calls one another up. The ways that we see kingdom seeds planted deep within people, that we would say, hey, I see a kingdom reality in you, that if you would walk with God and love him with all your heart, man, God can do some amazing things in you in this area. I believe that with all my whole heart. So Lord, I pray that you would help us in these family dynamics. It won't change overnight, but help us to be bold, to take a step this week to have a healthier family dynamic or a healthier relationship and a mentoring relationship. We pray this in Jesus' name, and all God's people said, amen. We got prayer partners back here. We'd love to pray with you if you have any prayer needs, anything burdening your heart. Otherwise, have a great Sunday. Be blessed.